The sun didn't forgive in the Gila territory. It punished. It scorched the cracked earth until the ground looked like broken pottery, and it bleached the bones of men foolish enough to believe they could outrun their debts. On this particular afternoon, as shadows stretched long and vultures circled lazy spirals overhead, the sun was watching Caleb Rourke die. He wasn't dead yet, not quite, but he was close enough to taste the copper promise of it on his tongue. Blood painted a wandering trail behind him through the dust, each crimson drop a breadcrumb marking his stumbling path across the wasteland. His left hand pressed tight against the wound in his side, fingers slick and trembling, while his right hand clutched an empty revolver he couldn't remember firing. The gun felt heavier now than it had during the ambush. Funny how metal weighs more when it can't save you. 3 days ago, Caleb had been part of something, a crew. Brothers, they'd called themselves, though none shared actual blood. The Rourke gang had carved a reputation across 4 territories: stagecoach robberies, bank jobs, the occasional train when they were feeling ambitious. They weren't the biggest outfit, but they were smart, careful. They planned their moves like chess players, always 3 steps ahead of the law, until they weren't. The job had seemed simple enough: a Union Pacific shipment moving through Saguaro Pass, gold bullion being transported to the territorial bank in Prescott. Inside information from a drunk clerk, solid intelligence on the route, minimal guard presence, easy money. The kind of score that would let them disappear for a year, maybe 2. Live like kings in Mexico, drink tequila on beaches, forget the smell of gunpowder and fear. But someone had talked, or someone had been followed, or maybe the frontier gods had simply decided the Rourke gang's luck had run its course. The ambush turned into a massacre. Federal marshals and hired guns had been waiting in the rocks above the pass, rifles already trained on the road below. Caleb's brothers, Jack, Thomas, and young Billy Crane, who wasn't even 20 yet, had died in the first 30 seconds of gunfire. Jack took a bullet through the throat before he could draw. Thomas made it 3 steps toward cover before the back of his head disappeared in a red mist. Billy screamed for his mother as he bled out in the dust, calling for a woman who'd been dead 6 years. Caleb had survived by doing what he'd always done best: running. He'd grabbed the saddlebag, the one containing their take from the shipment, and spurred his horse into a desperate gallop, while bullets whined past his ears like angry hornets. He'd felt one catch him in the side, a punch of fire that nearly knocked him from the saddle, but adrenaline kept him upright. He rode hard for 2 hours before his horse collapsed beneath him, its heart giving out from the strain. He'd kept running on foot, the saddlebag growing heavier with each mile, his wound bleeding steadily through his shirt. That had been yesterday morning, or maybe the day before. Time had started to blur somewhere around the point where the pain became constant and the thirst turned his tongue to leather. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Caleb topped a low rise and saw something that made him think maybe the frontier gods weren't quite finished with him yet. A house. Not much of one. A weathered homestead that looked like it had been fighting the desert for years and was slowly losing. Single story, adobe and timber construction, with a sagging porch and a roof that probably leaked when it rained. A small barn stood maybe 50 yards off, equally worn, and a windmill creaked in the evening breeze, pumping water into a wooden trough. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and gray, carrying the impossible, beautiful smell of cooking food. Civilization, shelter, water. Caleb tried to call out, but only managed to croak. His legs buckled, and he went down hard, the saddlebag landing beside him with a muffled thump. The impact sent fresh pain screaming through his side, and for a moment everything went white and distant. When his vision cleared, he was staring at the sky, watching it fade from blue to purple to something darker. He heard footsteps, boots on hard ground moving cautiously. "Don't move!" A woman's voice, hard and flat. "I've got a rifle on you, and I know how to use it." Caleb managed to turn his head. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he saw her, a woman maybe 30 years old, wearing a simple cotton dress covered by a work apron. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face was lean and weathered by sun and hardship. The rifle in her hands was a Winchester, well-maintained, held steady, and pointed directly at his chest. "Please," Caleb managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Water." She didn't move. She didn't. Her eyes, gray as a winter sky, studied him with the kind of wariness that came from living alone in hard country. She took in his blood-stained shirt, his empty revolver, the saddlebag lying in the dust. "You running from something or toward it?" she asked. "Does it matter?" "It might, depending on whether what's chasing you shows up at my door." Caleb tried to sit up and failed. I'm not a threat. Please, just water, then I'll go." She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the rifle never wavering. Then, without taking her eyes off him or lowering the weapon, she called over her shoulder, "Sarah, bring the canteen and stay on the porch." A girl appeared in the doorway, maybe 12 years old, with the same dark hair as the woman. She grabbed a canteen from a hook by the door and brought it to the edge of the porch, setting it down carefully before retreating back inside. The woman, Eliza, though Caleb didn't know her name yet, walked forward slowly, keeping the rifle trained on him. With one hand, she picked up the canteen and tossed it toward him. It landed in the dust a few feet away. Caleb crawled to it, each movement a fresh agony, and unscrewed the cap with shaking hands. The water was warm and tasted like metal and minerals, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever experienced. He drank too fast, choked, coughed up blood-tinged water, then drank more. "Easy," Eliza said. "You'll make yourself sick." When he'd drained half the canteen, Caleb let his head fall back, gasping. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I haven't decided whether to let you stay or shoot you and save myself the trouble." She nodded toward his wound. "How'd you get that?" Caleb's mind raced, even through the fog of pain. He needed a story, something that would buy him time, shelter, a chance to rest and heal before moving on. The truth, that he was an outlaw with a bounty on his head and half the territory's killers looking for him, would get him nothing but a bullet. His hand moved to his belt, where he'd tucked something during his desperate flight. A badge. Silver star, badly tarnished. He'd taken it from a dead deputy 2 years ago, kept it as a souvenir. Now it might be his salvation. He pulled it out, held it up so the dying sunlight caught the metal. "I'm a lawman," he said, putting everything he had into making his voice sound steady and sincere. "Deputy Marshal was tracking a gang of outlaws when they ambushed me, killed my partner. I barely got away." Eliza's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, the rifle still steady, and looked at the badge. Her expression didn't change. "What's your name, Marshal?" "Rourke. Caleb Rourke." "Where's your horse?" "Dead, 3 miles back. Ran it too hard trying to escape." "Your gun's empty." "I know. Used my last bullets in the fight. Haven't had a chance to reload." She studied him for a long moment, and Caleb felt sweat that had nothing to do with his wound trickling down his back. She was smart, this one. Careful. The kind of person who'd survived in hard country by trusting her instincts, and right now those instincts were probably screaming that something wasn't right. Finally, she lowered the rifle. Not all the way, just enough to suggest she'd made a decision, even if it wasn't a comfortable one. "You can stay the night," she said. "In the barn. I'll bring you some food and clean bandages for that wound. Come morning, you're gone. Understood?" Caleb nodded, relief washing through him so powerfully it made him dizzy. "Understood. I'm grateful, ma'am." "Don't be grateful yet. And it's Mrs. Vance, Eliza Vance. This is my homestead and my rules. You step 1 foot toward the house without my say-so, and I'll put a bullet in you. Won't ask questions, won't feel bad about it. Clear?" "Clear's glass, Mrs. Vance." "Sarah," Eliza called toward the house. "Help me get him to the barn." The girl emerged again, cautious as a wild animal. Together, they got Caleb to his feet, and with one arm draped over Eliza's shoulders and the other clutching the saddlebag, they half carried, half dragged him across the yard to the barn. The interior was dim and smelled of hay and animal warmth. A milk cow stood in one stall, regarding them with placid indifference. Sarah spread some clean straw in an empty stall, while Eliza lowered Caleb onto it as gently as the situation allowed. "I'll be back with food and supplies," Eliza said. "Sarah, come with me." "Can I ask him questions?" the girl asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "No. Inside. Now." They left, and Caleb was alone with the cow and the gathering darkness. He lay back in the straw, one hand pressed against his wound, the other resting on the saddlebag containing stolen gold worth more than this entire homestead, worth more than Eliza Vance's life, or her daughter's, or the life of anyone foolish enough to get between Caleb and his escape. He closed his eyes, listening to the evening sounds. The windmills creak, the cows breathing, distant coyotes beginning their nightly chorus. He'd bought himself time. A night, maybe two if he played his cards right. Long enough to rest, to let the wound stabilize, to plan his next move. The badge had worked, the lie had held. For now. Eliza returned an hour later carrying a wooden tray with a bowl of stew, some bread, and a cloth bundle that turned out to contain bandages and a bottle of whiskey. She set the tray down just inside the stall, keeping her distance. "The whiskey's for cleaning the wound," she said. "Not drinking." "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." She watched as he ate, slowly at first, his stomach protesting the richness of real food after days of nothing, and when he was done, she pointed at his shirt. "Let me see that wound." Caleb hesitated. The bullet had caught him just above his left hip, angled upward. He'd been lucky. It had gone clean through without hitting anything vital, as far as he could tell. But the entry and exit holes were ugly, inflamed, and starting to show signs of infection. He unbuttoned his shirt, and Eliza sucked in a breath when she saw it. "That's a bullet wound," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Like I said, I know what you said. But there's a difference between knowing someone got shot and seeing the hole." She knelt beside him, her hands surprisingly gentle as she examined the wound. "You're lucky. Went clean through. But it's getting infected. This is going to hurt." She wasn't lying. The whiskey burned like liquid fire when she poured it into both the entry and exit wounds, and Caleb had to bite down on a piece of leather strap to keep from screaming. Tears streamed down his face as she cleaned the wounds thoroughly, then packed them with clean cloth and bound his torso with strips of torn bedsheet. "Change those bandages twice a day," she said when she was done. "Keep the wounds clean. If you start running a fever, you're in trouble." "Thank you, Mrs. Vance, truly." She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because leaving a man to die on my land would haunt me, and I've got enough ghosts already." Before Caleb could ask what that meant, she turned and walked toward the barn door. She paused there, silhouetted against the purple twilight. "My husband's coming home tomorrow," she said without turning around. "He's been in Tucson selling cattle. He won't be as welcoming as I've been. I'll be gone by then." "See that you are?" She left, and this time she didn't come back. Caleb lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds and feeling the throb of his wound beneath the clean bandages. His mind worked through possibilities, calculating odds, planning contingencies. The husband complicated things, but Caleb had dealt with angry husbands before. The key was to stay calm, stick to the story, and be gone before questions got too pointed. He reached for the saddlebag and opened it, just to verify its contents were still there. Gold coins caught the moonlight filtering through the barn's gaps. Spanish doubloons, American eagles, all freshly minted. The Union Pacific shipment had been worth $12,000. A fortune. Enough to disappear forever. Enough to kill for. Enough to die for. Caleb closed the bag and used it as a pillow, one hand resting on top. Tomorrow he'd need to figure out his next move. The nearest town was probably 30 miles in any direction, and he couldn't make that journey on foot with a hole in his side. He'd need a horse. Maybe he could buy one from Eliza, or her husband when he returned. The stolen badge might be good for credit, or at least trust. Or maybe he'd just take what he needed and leave them alive, if they were smart enough not to try stopping him. He was drifting toward sleep when he heard it, a sound that froze the blood in his veins. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace, coming from the direction he'd arrived. Caleb sat up, ignoring the protest of his wound, and moved to a gap in the barn wall where he could see out across the desert. The moon was bright enough to paint the landscape in shades of silver and black, and against that backdrop, he saw them. Riders, 4 of them, moving in a loose formation, following his trail. His hand went instinctively to his empty revolver, then dropped away. Useless. He had no bullets, no horse, no way to run. If those riders came here, if they found him, but they didn't come to the homestead. They passed within a quarter mile, close enough that Caleb could see their silhouettes, but too far away to make out faces. They were tracking him, following the blood trail and broken brush, but in the darkness, they'd missed the point where he'd turned toward Eliza's property. Caleb watched them disappear into the night, heading west toward nothing but empty desert and eventually the Colorado River. They'd realize their mistake eventually, probably by morning, and then they'd backtrack, circle around, expand their search pattern, and they'd find this place. He had less time than he'd thought. Morning came too early and too bright. Caleb woke to sunlight streaming through the barn's gaps and the sound of someone moving around outside. He sat up carefully, testing his wound. It hurt, sharp and deep. But the pain was cleaner now, less like fire and more like the honest ache of healing flesh. The barn door swung open, and Sarah stood there with another tray. This one held a tin plate with eggs and bacon, some more bread, and a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven. "Ma says you should eat," the girl said, setting the tray down. Unlike her mother, she didn't keep her distance. Curiosity won out over caution, and she sat cross-legged in the straw a few feet away, watching him with bright, intelligent eyes. "Tell your mother thank you," Caleb said, picking up the coffee. The first sip nearly made him groan with pleasure. "This is real kind of her." "Are you really a marshal?" Sarah asked. "I am." "Where's your star? The badge Ma said you showed her?" Caleb pulled it from his pocket and held it up. Sarah leaned forward, studying it with the intensity of someone who'd probably never seen a real lawman's badge before. "It's dirty," she observed. "Been through a lot with me." "Did you really catch bad men?" "I've caught my share." "Did you ever shoot anyone?" "Sarah!" Eliza's voice cut across the yard sharp as a whip crack. The woman appeared in the barn doorway, flour dusting her hands and disapproval etched into her features. "What did I tell you about bothering our guest?" "I wasn't bothering him, Ma. I was just inside, now. We've got bread to finish." Sarah stood reluctantly, casting one last curious look at Caleb before scurrying past her mother. Eliza watched her go, then turned her attention to Caleb. "How's the wound?" "Better. Your doctoring helped." "I'm not a doctor, just someone who's had to patch up enough injuries to know the basics." She paused, then added, "My husband will be here by noon. You should be gone by then." Caleb set down the coffee cup. "Mrs. Vance, I appreciate your hospitality, truly, but I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not in any shape to travel yet. That wound opens up again. I'll bleed out before I make it 5 miles. And I've got no horse, no supplies, and no bullets for my gun." Eliza's expression didn't change. "That sounds like a lot of problems that aren't mine. I'm not asking for charity. I can pay." He reached for the saddlebag, but Eliza's hand went to the revolver she had tucked into her belt. A different one from yesterday, smaller, easier to conceal. Caleb froze. "Slow," she said. Moving carefully, Caleb opened the saddlebag just wide enough for her to see the gold inside. Her eyes widened fractionally. "That's a lot of money for a deputy marshal to be carrying," she said quietly. "Confiscated from the outlaws I was tracking. Evidence. I'm supposed to transport it to the territorial office in Phoenix." "Phoenix is east. You were heading west." Damn. She was sharp. Caleb scrambled for an explanation. "Had to circle around. The gang's still out there, and they want this gold back. I figured heading west would throw them off. Then I could double back through the mining settlements." Eliza studied him for a long moment, and Caleb could practically see her mind working, weighing his words, looking for the cracks in his story. $50, she finally said. "For a horse. An old one. But it'll carry you. Some supplies and bullets for that revolver of yours. You're gone in an hour." It was more than fair. Too fair, actually, which meant she wanted him gone badly. That was fine with Caleb. He wanted to be gone too before those riders backtracked and found this place. "Deal," he said. Eliza nodded. "I'll get the horse ready. You stay here." She left, and Caleb finished his breakfast, his mind already planning the route. West first, to make it look like he was still running that direction, then north toward the mining camps in the Superstition Mountains. He could hide there for weeks if needed, let the heat die down, maybe find a fence who'd take the gold and give him clean money. The plan was solid, simple, survivable. Then he heard another sound that changed everything. More hoofbeats. But this time, just one horse, coming from the east. Caleb moved to the gap in the barn wall and looked out. A single rider was approaching the homestead, moving at an easy lope. Even from a distance, Caleb could tell this wasn't one of the men who'd passed in the night. This rider sat different in the saddle, confident, relaxed, like someone coming home. The husband. Caleb watched as the man dismounted in the yard. He was tall, maybe 40, with the kind of weathered look that came from years of hard work under a hard sun. He wore simple work clothes and a gun belt with a well-used Colt holstered on his right hip. Eliza came out of the house, and even from the barn, Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders. The husband, he'd have to be James Vance, Caleb figured, pulled her into an embrace that she returned stiffly. They were talking, but Caleb couldn't hear the words. Then Sarah ran out of the house, and the husband scooped her up, and for a moment everything looked like a normal family reunion. Then Eliza pointed toward the barn. James Vance's posture changed instantly. His hand dropped to his gun, and he started walking toward the barn with the kind of purposeful stride that Caleb had seen 1,000 times before. It was the walk of a man heading toward a problem he intended to solve. Caleb stepped back from the gap in the wall and considered his options. He still had no bullets. His wound made him slow and weak, and even if he was at full strength, he couldn't afford a fight. Not here, not now, not with those other riders somewhere nearby. He'd have to talk his way out. The barn door swung open hard, slamming against the wall. James Vance stood silhouetted against the bright morning sun, his hand on his gun but not drawing it yet. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Caleb raised his hands slowly, making sure they were empty and visible. "Deputy Marshal Caleb Rourke, your wife was kind enough to let me shelter here after I was wounded in the line of duty." "A marshal?" James's voice was flat, skeptical. "Out here." "Yes, sir. Was tracking a gang of outlaws when—" "Show me your badge." Caleb produced it with his left hand, moving slow and careful. James stepped forward, snatched it from his grasp, and examined it in the sunlight. His eyes narrowed. "This badge is tarnished to hell and back." "It's been through a lot." "What department?" "Territorial Marshal's office." "Phoenix Division." "Who's the chief marshal in Phoenix?" Caleb's mind raced. He had no idea. Had never been to Phoenix, at least not in any official capacity. He took a gamble on a common name. "Wilson. Chief Marshal Robert Wilson." James's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, doubt, maybe, or confirmation of a suspicion. "There's no Chief Marshal Wilson in Phoenix," he said quietly. "The Territorial Marshal is a man named Dake, Crawley Dake. Everyone knows that." The air in the barn seemed to freeze. Caleb's hand moved fractionally toward the saddlebag, toward where his useless gun lay, but James's Colt cleared leather faster than Caleb would have thought possible. "Don't," James said. "Don't even think about it." Caleb froze. His mind spun through possibilities, angles, ways out. Nothing looked good. "Listen," he started, "there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding was my wife thinking you were worth saving." James kept the gun steady, trained on Caleb's chest. "Now you're going to tell me the truth. Who are you, really? What are you running from?" Before Caleb could answer, Eliza appeared in the barn doorway, the Winchester in her hands again. "James," she said quietly, "don't do anything hasty. He lied to you, Eliza. He's no lawman." "I know." That brought James up short. He glanced at his wife without lowering his gun. "You knew?" "I suspected. The badge was wrong. Too old. Wrong department markings. His story had holes, but he was bleeding out in our yard and I couldn't just let him die." "So you brought a lying stranger into our home? With Sarah here?" "I put him in the barn, not the house. I kept watch. I was careful." James's jaw worked, anger and betrayal warring in his expression. Then he turned back to Caleb. "Last chance. The truth. Now." Caleb looked from the gun to James's face to Eliza standing in the doorway. He could keep lying, but the moment for lies had passed. Or he could tell the truth and hope that somehow, impossibly, these people would let him walk away. Or he could try option 3. "My name is Caleb Rourke," he said slowly. "And you're right. I'm no marshal. I'm an outlaw. Was part of a gang that hit a Union Pacific shipment 3 days ago. My crew got killed in an ambush. I got away with the gold." He nodded toward the saddlebag. $12,000 worth. And right now there are at least 4 men tracking me, trying to take it. They passed this place last night heading west, but they'll backtrack eventually. They'll come here. "Then you've brought danger to my family," James said, his voice cold as winter stone. "I didn't mean to. I was dying. Your wife showed mercy. I'm grateful for it. And now I'm offering you a chance to profit from it." Caleb met James's eyes steadily. "Give me a horse and supplies, let me go, and I'll give you $1,000 from that bag. Gold coin. More money than you'd make in 5 years of ranching. You'll never see me again, and when those men come asking questions, you tell them the truth. A wounded stranger showed up. You fed him. He left. You don't know where he went." "Blood money," James said. "Money spends the same, whatever its color." Eliza spoke up from the doorway. "James, listen to him. You want me to help an outlaw? I want you to think about Sarah, about this ranch, about what $1,000 could do for us." Her voice softened. "We could fix the well, buy breeding stock, maybe finally visit your sister in San Francisco like we always talked about." James's gun hand wavered just slightly. Caleb could see the war happening behind his eyes, duty versus pragmatism, morality versus opportunity. "How do I know you won't come back?" James asked. "How do I know you won't bring more trouble?" "You don't," Caleb admitted. "But I give you my word, for whatever an outlaw's word is worth, that once I leave here, I'm heading for Mexico and never looking back. This territory's burned for me. I know it. I accept it. I just need enough head start to make it to the border." The silence stretched out, broken only by the creak of the windmill outside and the shuffling of the cow in its stall. Then, slowly, James lowered his gun. "2,000, he said. "What?" $2,000. "For my silence, a horse, supplies, ammunition, and 2 days of shelter while you heal up enough to travel. Those men tracking you will pass through soon enough, and if they stop here, I'll send them in the wrong direction. But it costs you 2,000. Caleb wanted to argue, but he was in no position to negotiate, and truthfully 2,000 still left him with 10, more than enough to start over south of the border. "Deal," he said. James holstered his gun and held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Caleb shook it. 2 days, James repeated. "Then you're gone. If you're still here after that, I'll shoot you myself and turn your body in for whatever bounty's on your head. Understood?" "Understood." James turned and walked out of the barn without another word. Eliza lingered in the doorway a moment longer, her gray eyes studying Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That was stupid," she said quietly, telling him the truth. "Was it? He already knew I was lying, and now he's got a reason to keep me alive and quiet instead of just putting a bullet in me and taking the gold anyway. You don't know James. He's not a killer. Everyone's a killer, Mrs. Vance, given the right circumstances, the right reasons." Caleb leaned back against the barn wall, suddenly exhausted. "Your husband's a smart man. He saw an opportunity and took it. Can't fault him for that. And when those men you mentioned show up? What then? Then your husband earns his $2,000 by lying convincingly. Think he can manage that?" Eliza's expression hardened. For his daughter's sake, he'll manage whatever he needs to. She left, and Caleb was alone again with his thoughts and his wound and his rapidly depleting options. 2 days. It wasn't much, but it was something. Time to heal, time to plan, time to figure out his next move. Assuming those riders didn't find this place first, assuming the Vances kept their word, assuming the desert didn't kill him before he made it to Mexico. A lot of assumptions for a man who'd run out of luck, but Caleb Rourke had always been good at playing bad hands. And this hand wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The rest of that day passed in tense quiet. Caleb stayed in the barn as instructed, resting and letting his body begin the slow work of healing. Eliza brought him lunch and dinner, barely speaking, her rifle always within reach. James didn't visit at all, which Caleb took as a good sign. The man was probably wrestling with what he'd agreed to, trying to square it with whatever moral code he lived by. Sarah tried to sneak out to the barn twice, and both times her mother caught her and sent her back inside with sharp words. As darkness fell, Caleb counted out $2,000 in gold coins and put them in a leather pouch he'd kept in the saddlebag. He set it near the barn door where James would find it when he came in the morning. Then he lay back in the straw and stared at the barn ceiling, watching shadows dance in the lamplight from the house. He thought about his brothers, Jack with his easy laugh, Thomas, who never met a poker hand he didn't think he could bluff, young Billy, who dreamed of buying a ranch and settling down. All dead now, their bodies probably still lying in Saguaro Pass unless the vultures and coyotes had scattered their bones. He thought about the clerk who'd sold them the information about the Union Pacific shipment. Had he been the betrayer, or had the marshals already been watching the clerk, waiting for someone to take the bait? He thought about tomorrow, and the day after, and what came next. Mostly, though, he tried not to think about the riders who were somewhere out in the darkness, searching, always searching. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams that felt more like memories. Gunfire and blood, his horse dying beneath him, the weight of the saddlebag growing heavier with every step. He woke sometime before dawn to the sound of horses. Multiple horses. Coming closer. Caleb was on his feet instantly, ignoring the protest of his wound. Through the gap in the barn wall, he could see them, 5 riders this time, not 4. They were approaching from the south, moving slowly, their horses tired from a long night's ride, the same men who'd passed yesterday, and they'd brought a friend. As Caleb watched, they split up. 3 headed toward the house while 2 circled around toward the barn. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before, surrounding, covering angles, leaving no escape. In the house, a lamp flickered to life. Caleb heard voices, sharp and urgent, James and Eliza, woken by the sound of approaching riders. Then the barn door burst open, and 2 men stepped inside, guns drawn. The first was short and stocky, with a thick black beard and eyes like chips of obsidian. The second was taller, leaner, with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. "Well, well," the bearded one said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Caleb couldn't quite place. "Look what we found." Caleb raised his hand slowly. "Gentlemen, can I help you with something?" "Yeah," the scarred man said, his gun never wavering. "You can hand over the gold you stole from the Rourke gang, and then you can tell us where Caleb Rourke ran off to." Caleb's mind raced. They didn't recognize him. These weren't outlaws who'd known his crew. They were bounty hunters, or maybe hired guns working for whoever had set up the ambush. They knew about the gold, knew about the Rourke gang, but they didn't know his face, which meant he had one more card to play, one more lie that might buy him a few more hours of life. "Rourke's dead," Caleb said. "I found his body 2 days' ride west of here. Looked like he bled out from a gunshot wound. The gold was with him. I took it." The 2 men exchanged glances. "You're a bounty hunter?" the bearded one asked. "Opportunist. Wrong place, right time. I was planning to turn the gold in, collect whatever reward there was, but then I got ambushed by Apaches and had to hole up here." Caleb nodded toward the house. "These folks have been real hospitable. No need to bother them." "Where's the gold now?" "In that saddlebag. All 12,000. You're welcome to count it." The scarred man moved forward and grabbed the saddlebag, keeping his gun trained on Caleb with his other hand. He opened it, and his eyes went wide when he saw the contents. "It's here," he breathed. "All of it." From outside, Caleb heard a scream, Sarah's voice, shrill with terror. Then a gunshot, loud and flat in the desert night. Caleb's blood turned to ice. The bearded man grinned. "Sounds like Garrett's getting impatient with your hospitable friends. Maybe we should go see what all the fuss is about." He grabbed Caleb by the arm and shoved him toward the door. The scarred man followed with the saddlebag, and together they marched Caleb across the yard toward the house. The scene that greeted them would haunt Caleb for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. James Vance lay on the porch, blood pooling beneath him from a wound in his chest. He was still alive, gasping like a fish out of water, his hands pressed uselessly against the hole. Eliza knelt beside him, her face white with shock and terror, while Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, screaming and screaming and screaming. A third man, Garrett, presumably, stood over them with a smoking revolver, looking bored. "Fool pulled a gun on me," Garrett said to his companions. "Didn't give me much choice." "The gold?" another man asked, this one older, gray-haired, with the look of someone in charge. "We got it," the scarred man said, holding up the saddlebag. "And we got the one who was carrying it." The gray-haired man turned his attention to Caleb. His eyes were cold and calculating. "You said Rourke was dead?" "That's right." "Where's the body?" "Like I said, 2 days west, near Painted Rock. Vultures probably have it by now." The gray-haired man studied him for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "You're lying. You're Rourke." Caleb's stomach dropped. "I don't know what—" "You match the description we were given. Height, build, that scar on your left hand." He pointed at Caleb's hand where an old knife wound had left a distinctive crescent-shaped scar. "And you're wounded in exactly the spot where Rourke got shot during the ambush at Saguaro Pass." Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Tie him up," the gray-haired man ordered. "We'll take him and the gold back to the federal marshal in Prescott. There's a $500 bounty on Rourke, dead or alive, plus a 10% recovery fee on the gold." The bearded man grabbed Caleb's arms and wrenched them behind his back, binding his wrists with rough hemp rope. On the porch, James Vance had stopped gasping. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky, and Eliza's screaming had replaced her daughter's. "What about them?" Garrett asked, nodding toward Eliza and Sarah. The gray-haired man considered for a moment. "Witnesses. They can testify to what happened here. Or we could make sure they don't testify to anything." "No." The gray-haired man's voice was firm. "We're not murderers. The man pulled a gun. You defended yourself. That's the truth, and that's what we'll say. No need to kill women and children." Garrett shrugged, holstering his weapon. "Your call, boss." They dragged Caleb toward the horses. As they passed the porch, Eliza looked up, and her eyes met Caleb's. The hatred in them was pure and absolute. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You brought this to us. You killed my husband." She was right, and Caleb knew it, but right didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the rope around his wrists and the barrel of the gun pressed against his spine, and the knowledge that his luck had finally, completely, run out. They threw him roughly onto a horse, tied his bound hands to the saddle horn, and started riding. As the homestead disappeared behind them, Caleb took one last look back. In the growing dawn light, he could see Eliza still kneeling beside her husband's body, and Sarah standing in the doorway, and the smoke still rising from the chimney where breakfast had been cooking before Hell arrived. Then they were gone, swallowed by the desert and the distance. And Caleb Rourke, the man who'd run from everything, had nowhere left to run. The ride to Prescott took 2 days, and every mile of it was agony, not just from the wound in Caleb's side, though that throbbed with each jarring step of the horse, not just from his hands bound so tight the rope cut into his wrists until they bled. The real agony was the knowledge of what he'd done. James Vance's dead eyes staring at nothing. Eliza's scream cutting through the dawn. Sarah frozen in that doorway, watching her world collapse. Caleb had killed men before, shot them in gunfights, left them bleeding in the dust after robberies gone wrong. But those had been men who'd chosen the same life he had, outlaws, lawmen, fools who thought they were faster with a gun than they really were. They'd known the risks. They'd played the game. James Vance had just been trying to protect his family. The gray-haired man leading the group was named Denton Chase, and he ran his operation like a military unit. They rode in formation, took turns on watch at night, and spoke only when necessary. Chase himself barely acknowledged Caleb's existence except to make sure he was still breathing and still bound. The others were more talkative, at least among themselves. Garrett, the one who'd shot James, was a cold-eyed killer who seemed to take pleasure in describing previous bounties he'd collected. The bearded man was called Rusty, and he never stopped complaining about the heat, the food, the pace, everything. The scarred man went by Pike, and he spent most of his time counting and recounting the gold coins, his fingers caressing them like a lover. The fifth man, the one who'd joined them between the first pass and their return to the Vance homestead, was younger than the others, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and a trigger finger that never stopped twitching. They called him Cotton, and Caleb figured he was either new to the bounty hunting game or regretting getting into it. They camped the first night in a dry wash, building a small fire and eating hardtack and beans. Caleb sat apart from them, still bound, his back against a boulder. Chase tossed him some food and a canteen, at least having the decency not to let his prisoner starve. "You got family, Rourke?" Chase asked, settling down across the fire from him. Caleb chewed the hardtack slowly, buying time to think about whether he wanted to answer. Finally, he swallowed and said, "Had brothers. They're dead now." "The ones in your gang?" "Yeah." "You close?" "Close enough." Chase nodded, pulling out a pipe and packing it with tobacco. "I got a brother, younger, works as a clerk in Tucson, married, got 3 kids, never broken a law in his life." He lit the pipe, took a draw, exhaled smoke into the night air. "Sometimes I wonder what it'd be like, living that kind of life. Predictable. Safe." "Then why don't you?" Caleb asked. "Because I'm good at this." Chase gestured vaguely at the camp, at his men, at Caleb. "Tracking, hunting, bringing in men who think they can outrun justice. It's what I know, and it pays better than clerking." "Justice," Caleb repeated, his voice bitter. "That what you call shooting an unarmed rancher?" Chase's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Garrett said the man drew on him." "Garrett's a liar. James Vance was trying to protect his family from armed strangers who showed up at his door before dawn. You really think that deserves a bullet?" "What I think doesn't matter. What happened, happened. Garrett will answer for it if the law decides he needs to. That's not my concern." "Your concern is the money." "My concern is bringing you to justice and recovering stolen property. The money's just compensation for doing a dangerous job." Chase studied Caleb through the pipe smoke. "You're not in a position to lecture anyone about morality, Rourke. You robbed a federal shipment, got your whole crew killed, brought violence to an innocent family. That rancher's blood is on your hands as much as Garrett's." Caleb wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Chase was right. If Caleb had never stumbled onto that homestead, James Vance would still be alive. Eliza would still have a husband. Sarah would still have a father. The weight of it settled on him like a physical thing, pressing down on his chest until breathing hurt worse than the wound in his side. "How much is the bounty on me?" Caleb asked, changing the subject because he couldn't bear the weight of the previous one. 500, like I said, dead or alive." "So why not just shoot me and save yourself the trouble of dragging me to Prescott?" "Because I'm not Garrett. I don't kill unless I have to." Chase took another draw on his pipe. "Besides, there's usually a bonus for bringing them in alive. Marshals like to have someone to question, especially when there might be other gang members still out there." "There aren't. They're all dead." "That what you're going to tell the marshal?" "That's the truth." Chase smiled faintly. "Truth and what people believe aren't always the same thing. Marshal might think you're holding back information, might get creative in trying to get you to talk." The implication was clear: torture, beatings, whatever it took to make Caleb give up information he didn't have. "I'm telling you, there's nobody left. The Rourke gang died in Saguaro Pass." "Then I guess you won't have much to worry about." Chase stood, stretching. "Get some sleep, Rourke. Long day tomorrow." He walked away, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and his guilt and the cold desert night closing in around him. Across the fire, Garrett was cleaning his gun, the firelight glinting off the barrel. He looked up and caught Caleb watching him. A slow smile spread across his face. "Something on your mind, Outlaw?" Caleb said nothing. "That rancher," Garrett continued, his voice conversational. "He really thought he could outdraw me. Funny how men always overestimate themselves right up until the moment they don't." "He wasn't trying to outdraw you," Caleb said quietly. "He was trying to protect his family. Same result either way. Dead is dead." Garrett slid a bullet into the chamber, closed the cylinder, spun it. "You think about that when they hang you. Dead is dead, and it don't matter much what the reason was." Pike laughed from where he sat nearby. "Garrett's got a point. Nobody remembers why you died, just that you did. James Vance, Caleb Rourke, couple of years from now, both of you will just be names on tombstones nobody visits. Assuming they even give you a tombstone," Rusty added. "Outlaws usually get buried in unmarked graves outside of town. Wouldn't want to contaminate the church cemetery with your kind." Caleb closed his eyes and tried to block out their voices, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he started to drift off, he saw James Vance falling, heard Eliza screaming, watched Sarah's world shatter in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The guilt gnawed at him like a living thing. Eventually, exhaustion won out over guilt, and he slipped into a fitful doze filled with dark dreams. He woke to someone kicking his boot. The sky was still dark, but dawn was coming. He could see the faint lightning along the eastern horizon. "Time to move," Chase said. "We want to make Prescott by tomorrow evening." They broke camp quickly, kicking dirt over the fire and saddling horses. Caleb's hands were untied long enough for him to relieve himself and eat some more hardtack, then bound again and secured to the saddle horn. The second day's ride was harder than the first. The wound in Caleb's side had started bleeding again from the constant jostling, and he could feel fever starting to build in his blood. His vision would occasionally blur, and more than once he nearly fell from the saddle before catching himself. Chase noticed but said nothing. The others noticed too, and Caleb could hear them placing bets on whether he'd make it to Prescott alive. $5 says he falls off dead before we hit Skull Valley, Rusty said. "I'll take that bet," Pike replied. "He's tougher than he looks. I say he makes it all the way." "How about neither of you get paid because I put a bullet in him right now," Garrett suggested. "Save us all the trouble." "Touch him, and you answer to me," Chase said, his voice flat and hard. "We bring him in alive or we don't get the bonus, and I want that bonus." Garrett subsided, but Caleb could feel the man's eyes on him, calculating, waiting for an excuse. They rode through country that grew gradually less barren as they traveled east. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and scrub oak. They passed a few scattered homesteads, smoke rising from chimneys, children playing in yards. Normal life. Peaceful life. The kind of life Caleb would never know. Around midday, they stopped to water the horses at a small creek. While the others tended to their mounts, Cotton approached Caleb with a canteen. "Here," the young man said, holding it to Caleb's lips. "Drink." Caleb drank gratefully, the water cool and sweet. When he'd had his fill, he looked at Cotton more closely. Up close, the young man looked even younger, maybe 22 at most, with a soft face that hadn't fully hardened yet. "You're new to this," Caleb observed. Cotton glanced nervously toward where Chase and the others were refilling canteens downstream. "Is it that obvious? You're the only one who looks at me like I'm a person instead of a payday. I joined up with Chase about 3 months ago, needed the money. My wife's sick, and doctors are expensive." Cotton looked down at his hands. "I thought bounty hunting would be, I don't know, different. Different how? More like the stories. Chasing desperados, bringing them to justice, making the frontier safer." He laughed bitterly. "Sounds stupid when I say it out loud." "Not stupid, just naive." Caleb shifted, trying to ease the pain in his side. "This what you thought justice looked like? Shooting ranchers? Dragging half-dead men across the desert? Garrett shouldn't have shot that man. I told Chase that." "What'd he say?" "That it wasn't my concern. That I'm here to do a job, not make moral judgments." Cotton met Caleb's eyes. "Were you really part of the gang that robbed that Union Pacific shipment?" "Yeah." "Why? Why do it? Why risk everything for money you can't spend if you're dead?" Caleb thought about that. It was a question he'd never really examined, even to himself. Why had he become an outlaw? When had the choice been made? "I was 15 when I held up my first stagecoach," he said finally. "My parents were dead, I was starving, and a man named Dutch Carter told me I could either die poor or get rich quick. Seemed like an easy choice at the time." "And you never thought about going straight? Getting an honest job?" "Thought about it plenty, but once you're on this side of the law, there's no crossing back. You try to settle down, become a farmer or a clerk or whatever, and someone always recognizes you. Someone always remembers. The past doesn't let go. So you just kept running. Until I couldn't run anymore." Caleb nodded toward the other bounty hunters. "Your boss is right about one thing. This is what justice looks like. Not pretty, not heroic, just final." Cotton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About your brothers. About that rancher. About all of it." Before Caleb could respond, Chase called out, "Cotton! Stop fraternizing with the prisoner and get over here. Cotton hurried away, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts again. They rode through the afternoon, the sun beating down mercilessly. Caleb's fever was definitely getting worse. He could feel it burning through him, making his thoughts slow and muddy. The landscape kept wavering at the edges of his vision, and twice he hallucinated that his dead brothers were riding alongside them, their faces pale and bloodless. By the time they made camp that second night, Caleb was barely conscious. He fell from his horse when they stopped, unable to keep his balance, and lay in the dust while the others set up camp around him. Chase knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his forehead. He's burning up. Infection set in. Leave him, Garrett said. If he dies, we still get the bounty. Half the bounty, Chase corrected, and I want the full amount. Pike, get the medical kit. Rusty, boil some water. We're going to try to save him. Why bother? Garrett demanded. He's just going to hang anyway. Because he hangs in Prescott, after a trial, like the law says. Not out here in the dirt because we couldn't keep a prisoner alive. Chase's voice was firm. Now, help me get his shirt off. Through the fever haze, Caleb felt hands pulling at his clothing, removing the blood-stained bandages Eliza had applied what felt like a lifetime ago. He heard someone whistle low. That's infected, all right, Pike said. Looks nasty. Clean it out, Chase ordered. Use the whiskey. What followed was pain beyond anything Caleb had experienced before. The whiskey burned like liquid fire when they poured it into the wound, and he couldn't hold back a scream that echoed across the empty hills. They packed the wound with some kind of salve that smelled like pine tar and death, then wrapped it with fresh bandages. Best we can do, Chase said. Either he fights off the infection or he doesn't. They gave him water and some broth made from jerky, though most of it just dribbled down his chin because his hands were still bound and he couldn't hold the cup steady. Then they laid him near the fire and left him there while they ate their own dinner and talked in low voices. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he was back in Saguaro Pass, watching his brothers die. Sometimes he was at the Vance homestead, seeing James fall over and over again. Sometimes he was somewhere else entirely, a place of heat and darkness where voices whispered accusations he couldn't quite understand. At some point during the night, he became aware of someone sitting beside him. He forced his eyes open and saw Cotton keeping watch. You still alive? The young man asked. Barely. That's something, I guess. Cotton fed the fire another piece of wood. Chase thinks you'll make it. Says you're too mean to die easy. He might be right. Caleb's voice was rough as gravel. Your wife, what's wrong with her? Cotton looked surprised by the question. Consumption. Doc says she's got maybe a year, maybe less. The medicine helps, but it's expensive. That's why you're out here. Yeah, figure if I can work with Chase for another 6 months, I'll have enough saved to keep her comfortable. Maybe even get her to California where the air's supposed to be better for people with lung trouble. What if you don't make it 6 months? This is dangerous work. More dangerous than watching my wife waste away while I sit on my hands. Cotton shook his head. At least out here I'm doing something, trying something. Caleb understood that. The need to act, even when action was futile. The refusal to just accept defeat lying down. Cotton, he said slowly, an idea forming through the fever fog. What would you do if I escaped? The young man tensed. Don't even think about it. I'm not trying anything, just curious. Would you chase me, shoot me? Cotton was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, Chase would chase you, Garrett would shoot you. Pike and Rusty would probably just take the gold and disappear. And me? He paused. I don't know what I'd do. That's honest, at least. But you're not escaping. You're too weak to stand, let alone run. And even if you could, where would you go? Every lawman and bounty hunter in the territory knows your face by now. You wouldn't make it 20 miles. Again, Cotton was right. Caleb's escape options had run out along with his luck. The best he could hope for now was to survive long enough to see Prescott, and maybe, just maybe, find some angle he hadn't thought of yet. But hope was running thin, and angles were running thinner. He closed his eyes and let the fever take him back down into darkness. When he woke again, it was morning. The fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving him weak and sweat-soaked but clear-headed for the first time in days. Chase was kicking dirt over the fire, and the others were already saddling horses. "He's awake!" Rusty called out. "Looks like Pike wins the bet." Pike grinned and held out his hand. "Pay up, Rusty. I told you he was tough." Grumbling, Rusty dug out $5 in coins and dropped them into Pike's palm. Chase came over and looked down at Caleb. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot and dragged across the desert for 2 days." "Good. That means you're lucid." Chase gestured, and Cotton came over to help Caleb to his feet. The world spun sickeningly, but Caleb managed to stay upright. "We'll reach Prescott by evening. Try not to die before then." "I'll do my best." They got him onto a horse, his hands bound to the saddle horn as always, and started riding. The landscape continued to change as they traveled, the desert giving way to grasslands and pine forests. They passed through a small settlement called Skull Valley around midday, and people stopped to stare at the bound prisoner being led through town. An old woman spat in the dust as they passed. A young boy threw a rock that bounced off Caleb's leg. A preacher stood on a corner and shouted about sin and damnation, his finger pointed directly at Caleb like an accusation from the heavens themselves. Caleb bore it all in silence, his head down, his thoughts turned inward. They stopped briefly to buy supplies and let the horses rest. While the others went into the general store, Garrett stayed behind to guard Caleb. He sat on a bench in front of the store, his gun across his lap, watching Caleb like a cat watching a wounded mouse. "You know what I think?" Garrett said after a while. Caleb didn't respond. "I think you're wondering if there's still a way out. Still some angle you can work, some play you can make." Garrett leaned forward. "I've hauled in maybe 30 men like you, Rourke. You know how many of them escaped?" Silence. "None. Not a single one. You know why? Because by the time I get my hands on them, their luck's already run out. They're done. Finished. All that's left is the formality of the hanging." "You're a real comfort," Caleb said. "I'm honest. That's more than most people will give you." Garrett pulled out his gun and began cleaning it. A casual gesture, but the threat was clear. That rancher at the homestead, he thought he still had options too. Thought he could protect his family, make a deal, come out of it all right. You see how that worked out for him. "You didn't have to kill him." "Sure I did. He was reaching for a gun. What was I supposed to do, wait and see if he actually planned to use it?" Garrett's eyes were cold. "You make your choices, you live with the consequences. Or in his case, you die with them." Before Caleb could respond, the others emerged from the store carrying bags of supplies. Chase counted out some money to the shopkeeper, then turned to his men. "Mount up. We're 3 hours out from Prescott, and I want to get there before dark." They rode on through the afternoon, following a well-traveled road that showed the marks of countless wagons and horses. They passed other travelers, merchants, families, prospectors heading to or from the goldfields. Most gave the bounty hunters a wide berth, recognizing them for what they were. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they topped a rise, and Caleb saw Prescott spread out below them. It was bigger than he'd expected, a proper town with maybe 2,000 people, laid out in a grid of streets around a central plaza. Church spires rose above the rooflines. Smoke from dozens of chimneys hazed the air. He could see the territorial courthouse, a 2-story brick building flying the American flag. Next to it stood what had to be the jail, smaller, squat, with barred windows that looked like dead eyes. His new home, for however long he had left. "Pretty, ain't it?" Pike said, riding up beside him. "Course, you'll only see it from inside a cell. Won't be quite so pretty from that angle." They descended into town as the street lamps were being lit. People stopped to watch them pass, the bounty hunters with their hard faces and harder eyes, and the prisoner bound and bleeding in their midst. A small boy ran alongside their horses for a while, shouting questions that nobody answered, until his mother called him back. Chase led them straight to the territorial marshal's office. He dismounted and went inside while the others waited in the street, guns ready in case Caleb tried something desperate. But Caleb had no fight left in him. The fever had drained whatever reserves he'd been running on, and the reality of his situation had finally sunk in completely. This was the end of the line. No more running, no more lies, no more luck. Chase emerged from the marshal's office, accompanied by a tall man with iron-gray hair and a marshal's star pinned to his vest. The man walked up to Caleb's horse and looked him over with the detached interest of someone examining livestock at market. "This is Caleb Rourke?" the marshal asked. "That's him," Chase confirmed. "Wounded, but alive, as requested." "And the gold?" Pike held up the saddlebag. "All $12,000 accounted for." The marshal nodded. "Get him inside. I'll process the paperwork for your payment." They pulled Caleb from his horse, less gently than necessary, and dragged him into the marshal's office. The interior was spare and functional, a desk covered in papers, a gun rack on one wall, wanted posters pinned to a board. And in the back, a door leading to the cells. The marshal unlocked it and led them through. There were 6 cells, all empty except for one holding a drunk who was snoring loudly. They shoved Caleb into the end cell, removed his bonds, and slammed the iron door shut with a sound of terrible finality. "Welcome to Prescott," the marshal said. "Make yourself comfortable. You're going to be here a while." Chase and his men filed out, already discussing how they'd split the reward money. Only Cotton lingered for a moment, meeting Caleb's eyes through the bars. "Good luck," he said quietly. Then he was gone, and Caleb was alone. He sank down onto the narrow cot against the wall and took stock of his situation. The cell was maybe 6 feet by 8, with stone walls, iron bars, and a small window too high and narrow to climb through. A bucket in the corner served as a privy. That was it. That was everything. Outside, he could hear Chase and the marshal discussing the details of the arrest, the recovery of the gold, the bonus payment. Their voices were casual, businesslike. Just another transaction in a long string of transactions. Caleb closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the stone wall. James Vance was dead because of him. Eliza was a widow because of him. Sarah was fatherless because of him. And for what? $12,000 that he'd never get to spend. A moment of greed that had cascaded into tragedy. The drunk in the other cell let out a particularly loud snore, then rolled over and went quiet. Caleb sat in the silence and waited for whatever came next. An hour later, the marshal returned with a doctor, a middle-aged man carrying a worn medical bag. They unlocked Caleb's cell, and the doctor examined his wound while the marshal watched from the doorway, hand resting on his gun. "Infected, but not as bad as it could be," the doctor pronounced. "Whoever treated this knew what they were doing. I'll clean it again and give you some laudanum for the pain. Change the bandages daily. You should be fine in a week or 2. "Just in time for the hanging," Caleb said. The doctor paused in his work. "That's not my department. I just keep prisoners alive until the law decides what to do with them." He finished the treatment, left some bottles of medicine and extra bandages, and departed without another word. The marshal locked the cell again and followed him out. Caleb took a dose of the laudanum, bitter and chalky, and felt the pain in his side begin to recede to a distant throb. The medicine made his thoughts fuzzy and slow, and for once that felt like a blessing. He was drifting toward sleep when he heard footsteps in the outer office. The door to the cells opened, and the marshal appeared again, this time accompanied by a man Caleb didn't recognize. This newcomer was tall and lean, maybe 50 years old, with a weathered face and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and forgotten nothing. He wore a black duster despite the evening heat, and a gun belt with a well-maintained Colt. But what caught Caleb's attention was the badge on his chest, different from the territorial marshal's star. Smaller, darker, stamped with an eagle and shield. Federal Marshal. "Caleb Rourke," the man said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more menacing. "My name is Boone Kessler. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal assigned to the robbery of federal property. You and I are going to have a conversation." Caleb sat up on the cot, the laudanum making his movement slow. "I've got nothing to say." "You will." Kessler pulled up a chair and sat down outside the cell, settling in like a man who had all the time in the world. "See, Mr. Rourke, I've been tracking your gang for 8 months. I know where you've been, what you've done, who you've worked with. I know about the bank in Yuma, the stage robberies near Flagstaff, the train outside Lordsburg. I know everything except one thing." "What's that?" "Who tipped you off about the Union Pacific shipment?" Kessler leaned forward, his eyes locked on Caleb's. "Someone inside the company told you about that gold. Someone gave you the route, the timing, the security details. I want that name." I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. And you're going to tell me. Because if you cooperate, if you give me useful information, I can make things easier for you. Maybe get the charges reduced. Maybe even avoid the rope. I'm not a rat. Your brothers are dead. Your gang is finished. Who exactly would you be betraying? Kessler's voice remained calm, reasonable. All I want is the name of the company man who sold you that information. You give me that, and I'll speak to the territorial judge on your behalf. Could mean the difference between hanging and 20 years in prison. 20 years is a long time, but at least you'd be breathing. Caleb wanted to tell him to go to hell, wanted to spit in his face, and refused to say another word. But the laudanum had loosened his tongue, and the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him like a physical force. There was no inside man, he said finally. We got the information from a drunk clerk in a Tucson saloon. He was bragging about the shipment, trying to impress a woman. We listened, we planned, we moved. That's all there was to it. Kessler's expression didn't change. The clerk's name? I don't know. We never got it. Just listened to him talk, then left before he noticed us paying attention. You're lying. I'm not. I swear I'm not. Kessler stood slowly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. I'll be back tomorrow, Mr. Rourke. You should spend tonight thinking very carefully about your situation, about what you want the rest of your very short life to look like. Because right now, you're on a fast track to the gallows. And once that rope goes around your neck, all your secrets die with you. He walked out, and the outer door closed with a sound like a coffin lid shutting. Caleb lay back down and stared at the ceiling. The laudanum was pulling him toward sleep, but his mind kept racing, turning over options, looking for angles that didn't exist. Kessler wanted information he didn't have. The territorial court wanted justice for the robbery. Chase and his men wanted their money. And somewhere out there, Eliza Vance wanted revenge for her dead husband. Everyone wanted something from Caleb Rourke. But all Caleb wanted was to turn back time, to make different choices, to be anywhere but here. The drunk in the other cell started snoring again, a rhythmic sound that somehow made the silence between snores even more oppressive. Caleb closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, knowing that when morning came, his problems would still be waiting, and knowing too that he was running out of time to solve them. The trial lasted 3 days, though the outcome was never in doubt. Caleb sat in the defendant's chair wearing clean clothes the marshal had provided, a white shirt and dark trousers that made him look almost respectable, almost human. The courtroom was packed with spectators who'd come to see the outlaw who'd robbed the Union Pacific and left a trail of bodies across the territory. They filled every bench, lined the walls, craned their necks to get a better look at the man who'd become a story they'd tell their grandchildren. The prosecutor was a sharp-eyed man named Hendricks, who laid out the case with methodical precision. The robbery, the stolen gold, the dead lawmen at Saguaro Pass, the testimony from Chase and his bounty hunters about Caleb's capture. Every piece fit together like a puzzle designed to have only one solution. Caleb's court-appointed lawyer was a young man fresh out of law school in San Francisco, earnest and well-meaning, but hopelessly outmatched. He tried to argue that Caleb had been coerced into the robbery by the other gang members, that he'd only joined because he was desperate and starving. He called no witnesses because there were none to call, and his cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses only seemed to strengthen their testimony. On the second day, Kessler took the stand. The federal marshal described the months-long investigation that had led to the ambush at Saguaro Pass, the careful planning that had gone into catching the Rourke gang in the act. He spoke calmly, professionally, painting a picture of dangerous criminals who'd terrorized the territory for years. And what happened when you confronted the defendants at Saguaro Pass? Hendricks asked. They opened fire immediately, Kessler replied. We had no choice but to return fire in defense of our lives. 3 members of the gang were killed in the exchange. The 4th, he nodded toward Caleb, escaped with the stolen property. In your professional opinion, Marshal Kessler, was Mr. Rourke a willing participant in this robbery? Absolutely. He was the one carrying the gold when he fled. He left his wounded companions behind to save himself and the money. That wasn't quite true. His brothers had already been dead when Caleb ran. But Caleb's lawyer didn't catch the subtle reframing. He let it stand, and the jury absorbed it like gospel truth. On the 3rd day, they brought in a surprise witness that made Caleb's blood run cold. Eliza Vance. She walked into the courtroom wearing black mourning clothes, her face pale and drawn. Sarah wasn't with her, probably left with neighbors or family, but her presence was felt in the protective way Eliza held herself, like she was shielding an invisible child. The prosecutor approached her gently. "Mrs. Vance, I know this is difficult. Thank you for making the journey to testify." "It needed to be done," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the grief etched into every line of her face. "Can you tell the court what happened on the morning of August 14th? Eliza took a breath. "A man arrived at our homestead the day before, wounded and claiming to be a deputy marshal. My husband was away in Tucson. Against my better judgment, I let the man shelter in our barn. He showed me a badge, told me a story about being ambushed by outlaws. I believed him." "And this man was the defendant?" "Yes, Caleb Rourke." "What happened when your husband returned?" Eliza's hands tightened on the railing of the witness box. James saw through the lies immediately. He confronted Mr. Rourke, and Mr. Rourke admitted he was an outlaw running from the law. He had stolen gold with him. My husband tried to make him leave, but before anything could be resolved, other men arrived, bounty hunters tracking Mr. Rourke. And then? My husband tried to protect our family. Her voice caught. "He made a move toward his gun, and one of the bounty hunters shot him. He died on our porch while our daughter watched." The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's pen. "Mrs. Vance," Hendricks said quietly, "in your opinion, would your husband be alive today if Mr. Rourke had never come to your homestead?" Caleb's lawyer stood. "Objection calls for speculation." "I'll allow it," the judge said. "The witness may answer." Eliza looked directly at Caleb for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her gray eyes were hard as flint. "No," she said. "If that man had died in the desert where he belonged, my husband would still be alive. My daughter would still have a father. Mr. Rourke brought death to our door as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. He wanted to argue, to explain, to somehow make her understand that he'd never meant for James to die. But what would be the point? She was right. The chain of events that led to James Vance's death had started the moment Caleb stumbled onto that homestead. His lawyer tried to salvage something on cross-examination. "Mrs. Vance, isn't it true that one of the bounty hunters, a man named Garrett, was the one who actually shot your husband?" "Yes." "And Mr. Rourke was bound and helpless at the time?" "Yes." "So he didn't kill your husband directly?" Eliza's expression didn't change. "He killed him by being there, by bringing those men to our home, by lying and putting us all in danger. The bullet may have come from someone else's gun, but the blame belongs to him." The lawyer had no response to that. He sat down, and Eliza was excused. She walked out of the courtroom without looking at Caleb again, her black dress trailing behind her like a shadow. The prosecution rested. The defense presented its closing argument, a desperate plea that Caleb was a product of his circumstances, that he deserved mercy, that hanging him wouldn't bring back the dead or heal the wounded. It was eloquent and passionate and completely ineffective. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. "We find the defendant, Caleb Rourke, guilty of robbery of federal property, guilty of fleeing lawful custody, guilty of accessory to the murder of Deputy Marshal Thomas Crawford at Saguaro Pass." He paused. "And we recommend the maximum penalty under territorial law." The judge nodded gravely. "Mr. Rourke, please stand." Caleb stood, his legs surprisingly steady. The room seemed to recede slightly, everything taking on a distant, dreamlike quality. "Caleb Rourke, you have been found guilty of serious crimes against the territory and the United States government. You have shown no remorse, offered no cooperation, and demonstrated no respect for the law or the lives you've destroyed. Therefore, I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out 1 week from today at sunrise. May you spend your remaining days contemplating the weight of your sins." The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. Guards moved forward to escort Caleb from the courtroom. As they led him toward the door, he caught one last glimpse of the spectators, some satisfied, some disappointed that the show was ending, most simply indifferent. Just another outlaw getting what he deserved. And standing at the back of the room, watching with those patient, calculating eyes, was Marshal Boone Kessler. They brought Caleb back to his cell and locked him in without ceremony. The drunk who'd been his only companion had been released 2 days earlier, so now Caleb was alone in the cell block, just him and the silence and the slow tick of the clock on the wall outside the cells. 1 week, 7 days, 168 hours. Not much time to make peace with the world. But then again, Caleb had never been much for making peace. He lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster. 17 visible from this angle. He wondered how many condemned men had done the same thing, lying in this exact spot, counting down their final hours. The territorial marshal, a man named Garrett, confusingly sharing a name with the bounty hunter who'd killed James Vance, came by in the evening with dinner. Beans and cornbread, same as every night. "You got a week," Garrett said, sliding the plate through the slot in the cell door. "You want to write any letters, send any final messages, you let me know. I'll make sure they get delivered." "I've got nobody to write to," Caleb said. "No family at all?" "Had brothers. They're dead." "Friends?" "The kind of friends I had aren't the letter-writing type." Garrett shrugged. "Suit yourself? Offer stands if you change your mind." He left, and Caleb ate mechanically, tasting nothing. When he was done, he set the plate aside and lay back down, trying to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the dead. Jack and Thomas and Billy bleeding out in Saguaro Pass, James Vance falling on his porch, even men from earlier jobs, earlier violence, a bank teller in Yuma who'd tried to be a hero, a stage driver outside Flagstaff who'd reached for a shotgun, an old prospector they'd robbed near the Colorado River who'd died of a heart attack from the shock. All the ghosts Caleb had made over the years, come to keep him company in his final week. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the outer office. The door opened and Kessler appeared, carrying a chair and a bottle of whiskey with 2 glasses. "Mind if I sit?" the marshal asked. "Do I have a choice?" "Not really." Kessler set up the chair outside the cell and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He slid one through the bars to Caleb. "Figured a condemned man deserves a drink." Caleb picked up the glass and studied it suspiciously. "You trying to get me drunk and talkative?" "I'm trying to have a conversation. Whether you get drunk is up to you." Kessler took a sip from his own glass. "You handled the trial well. Most men would have broken down, begged, tried to bargain. You just sat there and took it. What was the point of doing anything else? The outcome was decided before it started." "True enough." Kessler refilled his glass. "That offer I made still stands, you know. You give me useful information, I can talk to the judge, maybe get your sentence commuted to life in prison. Wouldn't be pleasant, but it beats hanging. I already told you everything I know." "No, you told me what you want me to believe. There's a difference." Kessler leaned forward. "See, Mr. Rourke, I've been doing this work for 20 years. I know when someone's holding back, and you're holding back." "I'm not." The drunk clerk's story doesn't hold water. The Union Pacific kept that shipment quiet. Only a handful of people knew about it. A clerk wouldn't have had access to that information, drunk or sober. Someone higher up sold you that intelligence, someone with real access. Caleb drank his whiskey in one swallow, feeling the burn all the way down. "Believe what you want. I can't give you information I don't have." Kessler studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to some decision. "All right. Let's say I believe you. Let's say there was no inside man, just incredibly good luck and observation. Why'd you do it, Rourke? Why rob that shipment when you had to know it was too big a score, too much heat?" "Because I'm an outlaw. It's what I do." "That's not an answer. That's a role you're playing." Kessler poured more whiskey for both of them. "I've tracked a lot of men like you. Some do it for the money. Some do it for the thrill. Some are just born mean, but you don't strike me as any of those types." "What type do I strike you as?" "A man who's been running so long he forgot what he was running from." Kessler's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You started young, didn't you? Fell in with bad people, made bad choices, and then found yourself on the wrong side of a line you couldn't cross back over. So you kept running, kept stealing, kept fighting, because stopping meant facing what you'd become." The accuracy of it stung. Caleb set his glass down harder than he'd intended. "You sound like a preacher." "I've heard my share of confessions. Comes with the territory." Kessler finished his whiskey and stood. I'll leave the bottle. You've got a week to think about whether you want to die with your secrets or die clean. Your choice. He walked out, leaving Caleb alone with the bottle and his thoughts. Over the next 3 days, Caleb fell into a strange routine. Meals came at regular intervals. The marshal checked on him twice daily. At night, Kessler would return with his chair and they'd talk. Sometimes about the case, sometimes about nothing in particular. The federal marshal seemed genuinely curious about Caleb's life, asking questions about his childhood, his first crimes, the years with the gang. Caleb found himself answering more than he'd intended. Maybe it was the whiskey. Maybe it was the knowledge that none of it mattered anymore. Or maybe it was just the need to tell someone, anyone, about the life he'd lived before it was erased completely. On the 4th day, they brought in a new prisoner, a young cowhand who'd gotten drunk and shot up a saloon. They put him in the cell next to Caleb's, and he spent most of his time either sleeping off his hangover or loudly proclaiming his innocence to anyone who'd listen. I didn't mean to shoot nobody, the cowhand insisted to Marshal Garrett. Gun just went off. Could have happened to anyone. You fired 6 shots, Garrett replied dryly. That's a lot of accidents. I was drunk. Ain't responsible for what a drunk man does. Judge'll sort that out. Till then, you're staying here. The cowhand finally noticed Caleb. Hey you, what are you in for? Robbery? Murder? The usual? They gonna hang you? In 3 days. The cowhand went quiet, sobering up fast. Jesus, I'm sorry, mister. Don't be. I earned it. That night, Kessler didn't come. Neither did the whiskey. Caleb lay awake listening to the cowhand's nervous breathing and the distant sounds of the town settling down for the night. Prescott was growing. New buildings going up, new people arriving every week. In a few years, it would probably be a real city, prosperous and civilized. Caleb wouldn't be around to see it. On the 5th day, something changed. Marshal Garrett came to the cell in the mid-morning, his expression troubled. You got a visitor. I don't know anyone in Prescott. She says you know her, says her name's Eliza Vance. Caleb's stomach dropped. I don't want to see her. She's insistent, says she needs to talk to you before. Tell her to go home. I already did. She won't leave. Garrett unlocked the cell door. Come on, you can talk to her in the office. I'll be right there, so don't try anything. They led Caleb to the outer office, where Eliza sat on a wooden bench, still wearing her morning black. She looked older than she had at the trial, worn down by grief and the long journey to Prescott. When Caleb entered, she stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mrs. Vance, Caleb said quietly, you shouldn't have come. I had to. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were red from crying. I need to know something, and I need to hear it from you. What? Did you know? She took a step toward him. When you came to our homestead, when you lied about being a marshal, did you know that men were tracking you? Did you know you were putting us in danger? Caleb met her eyes. I knew someone was following me. I didn't know they'd find your place. I didn't know your husband would die. I swear I didn't know. But you suspected. Yes. And you came anyway. You used us as shelter, knowing you might be bringing death with you. Yes. Eliza's hands tightened into fists. My daughter asks about her father every day. She doesn't understand why he's not coming back. She's 12 years old, and I have to explain to her that a man's selfishness took him away from us forever. I'm sorry, Caleb said, and he meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. I know that doesn't help. I know it doesn't bring him back, but I am truly, deeply sorry for what happened. Sorry doesn't feed us. Sorry doesn't fix the well or mend the fences or do the 100 things James used to do. Tears were streaming down Eliza's face now. Sorry is just a word people say when they want to feel better about the harm they've caused. You're right. I came here to watch you hang, Eliza said, her voice breaking. I wanted to see you pay for what you did. I wanted to watch you die and feel satisfied that justice was done. And I don't feel satisfied. I feel empty. I feel angry. I feel like even watching you die won't be enough to balance what was taken from us. She wiped her eyes roughly. But I'll be there anyway. At sunrise in 2 days, I'll watch, and I'll remember my husband, and I'll make sure someone bears witness to what your choices cost." She turned and walked out without waiting for a response. Garrett escorted Caleb back to his cell. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? That evening, Kessler returned with his chair and whiskey, but Caleb wasn't in the mood for conversation. He took the glass and drank it silently, staring at the wall. "Heard Eliza Vance came by," Kessler said after a while. "News travels fast." "It's a small town. People talk." Kessler poured himself a drink. "What'd she want?" "To make sure I understood what I'd taken from her." "And do you?" "Yeah, I understand." Caleb drained his glass. "Doesn't change anything, but I understand." Kessler was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I think the real tragedy is, Rourke? Not that you're going to hang. You broke the law. People died. You deserve what's coming. The tragedy is that somewhere along the way, you probably could have been something different, made different choices, lived a different life." "Maybe, but I didn't." "No, you didn't." Kessler stood to leave. "Tomorrow's your last full day. You should spend it making whatever peace you can with how you lived." After he left, Caleb lay on his cot and thought about peace. He'd never been a peaceful man, even before he became an outlaw. There'd always been anger in him, restlessness, a need to push against boundaries and rules. Maybe Kessler was right. Maybe he'd been running from something his whole life. Or maybe he'd just been unlucky enough to be born into circumstances that pointed him in one direction and one direction only. The next day, his last full day alive, passed in a strange, suspended time. Morning came and went. Afternoon dragged by. The cowhand in the next cell tried to make conversation, but Caleb ignored him. What was there to talk about? Marshal Garrett came by in the evening. "Carpenter finished the gallows this afternoon. They're testing it now, making sure everything works right. Should be all set for tomorrow morning." "That's real considerate." "You want anything special for your last meal? Within reason." Caleb thought about it. "Steak, eggs, coffee, whiskey, if you'll allow it." "I'll allow it." Garrett paused. "Preacher wants to come by tonight, offer you spiritual counsel. You want to see him?" "No." "You sure?" "Most men want someone to pray with before—" "I'm sure." Garrett shrugged and left. The last meal arrived around 8 o'clock, and it was everything Caleb had asked for. The steak was cooked perfectly, the eggs were fresh, and the coffee was strong enough to strip paint. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, knowing it was the last food he'd ever taste. The whiskey came with the meal, a whole bottle of decent Kentucky bourbon. Caleb poured himself a glass and held it up to the lamplight, watching the amber liquid catch and reflect the flame. "To Jack, Thomas, and Billy," he said quietly. "Hope you boys found somewhere better than this." He drank. "To James Vance, wrong place, wrong time. Deserved better." He drank again. "And to me, you stupid, stubborn fool. You should have died in the desert." He finished the glass and poured another. Kessler came by around 10, as Caleb had known he would. The marshal looked at the half-empty whiskey bottle and raised an eyebrow. "Starting early?" "Seemed appropriate." Caleb poured a glass and slid it through the bars. "Join me?" They drank in silence for a while. Finally, Kessler said, "I want you to know something, Rourke. This isn't personal. I don't take pleasure in seeing men hang. But you don't lose sleep over it either." "No, I don't. The law is the law. You break it, you pay the price. That's how civilization works." "Civilization," Caleb repeated. "That what we're building out here? Civilization?" "We're trying. Doesn't always work, doesn't always look pretty, but we're trying." Kessler finished his drink. "You could have been part of it, you know. Could have settled down, bought some land, raised cattle or crops or whatever. Nobody would have cared about your past if you just stopped running." "That's not true, and you know it. The past doesn't let go that easy." "Maybe not, but you never even tried." Kessler stood. "I'll be there tomorrow. At the hanging, bearing witness, like Eliza Vance, making sure it's done right. Wouldn't expect anything less." After Kessler left, Caleb finished the bottle alone. The whiskey dulled the edges of his fear, made everything feel distant and manageable. He lay down on the cot and closed his eyes, not expecting sleep but hoping for it anyway. Surprisingly, it came. He dreamed of the desert, of riding through endless sand under an endless sky. In the dream, He wasn't running from anything, or toward anything. He was just riding, and the desert went on forever, and nobody was chasing him, and there were no choices to make and no consequences to face. It was peaceful. He woke to the sound of the outer door opening. For a moment, still caught in the dream, he thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. Maybe he'd wake up somewhere else, someone else, with a different life stretching out ahead of him. Then he saw the gray light of pre-dawn filtering through the high window, and he knew. This was the day he died. Marshal Garrett appeared at the cell door with 2 deputies. "Time, Rourke." Caleb sat up, his head pounding from the whiskey. "What time is it?" 5:30. "Hanging's at 6. Need to get you ready." They unlocked the cell and brought him out. One of the deputies produced a set of leg irons, insurance against any last-minute escape attempt, and secured them around Caleb's ankles. The metal was cold and heavy. "You want to clean up?" Garrett asked. "We got a basin and razor if you want to shave." "What's the point?" "Some men like to meet their end looking presentable." Caleb almost laughed. "Sure. Why not?" They let him wash his face and hands, shave the week's growth of beard from his jaw. When he was done, he looked at himself in the small mirror they'd provided. The face looking back was gaunt, hollow-eyed, older than its 32 years. But it was clean. "That's good enough," he said. They led him out of the office into the pre-dawn streets of Prescott. A crowd had already gathered around the gallows in the plaza, maybe 200 people, come to watch justice served. Some were townspeople. Some were curiosity seekers who'd traveled from neighboring settlements. A few were reporters with notebooks, ready to record the event for their newspapers. And standing at the front of the crowd, dressed in black, was Eliza Vance. Their eyes met for just a moment. Caleb tried to convey something, apology, regret, acknowledgement, but her expression remained hard and closed. She'd come to watch him die, and that's all there was to it. The gallows stood in the center of the plaza, new wood gleaming in the lamplight. 13 steps led up to the platform. A thick rope dangled from the crossbeam, the noose already tied, the knot positioned exactly where it needed to be to break a man's neck cleanly. Marshal Garrett stopped at the base of the steps. "You got any last words you want to say?" Caleb looked at the crowd, at all those faces waiting for him to give them something memorable. A confession, a curse, a plea for mercy, something they could repeat in saloons and around dinner tables for years to come, but he had nothing to say that would mean anything to them. "Let's get this done," he said. They walked up the 13 steps together, Caleb's leg irons clanking with each step. On the platform, the hangman waited, a fat man with a black hood covering his face. He nodded to Garrett, who positioned Caleb on the trapdoor and secured his hands behind his back. The sky was lightening now, dawn breaking pink and gold over the eastern mountains. It was going to be a beautiful day. The hangman approached with the noose. Up close, Caleb could see the rough texture of the hemp, the careful way the knot had been tied. 13 coils and a hangman's noose, he'd heard once. Supposed to be unlucky. "Any last words?" Garrett asked again, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Caleb took a breath, then another. His heart was hammering in his chest, and his legs wanted to shake, but he forced them steady. He wouldn't give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing him break. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "For all of it. For the robberies, for the deaths, for every choice that brought me here. I'm sorry to Eliza Vance and her daughter for what I took from them. I'm sorry to the families of the lawmen who died at Saguaro Pass. I'm sorry to every person I hurt along the way. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't matter, but I needed to say it." He paused, then added, "And I'm ready." The hangman slipped the noose over his head and tightened it around his neck. The rope was rough against his skin, already starting to chafe. The black hood came next, plunging everything into darkness. In the darkness, Caleb heard Garrett's voice, formal and distant. "Caleb Rourke, you have been tried and convicted of robbery and accessory to murder. You have been sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. May you find peace in the hereafter. Sentence will now be carried out." Caleb's breathing was loud in the enclosed space of the hood. His heart raced. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand here and wait for death. But there was nowhere to run. No fight left to fight. No luck left at all. He heard the hangman step back, heard the crowd draw a collective breath. And in that final moment, Caleb Rourke thought about the desert, about riding through endless sand under an endless sky, about a peace he'd never found in life. The trapdoor dropped. There was a crack, loud and sharp, that echoed across the plaza. And then there was nothing. The crowd watched in silence as Caleb Rourke's body swung gently in the morning breeze. Some had expected more drama, a struggle, screams, the violent thrashing of a man fighting death. But the hangman had done his job well. The neck had broken cleanly on the drop, and death had come quick and certain. Marshal Garrett checked his pocket watch. 6 minutes. Standard protocol required the body to hang for 10 to ensure death was complete. He stood at attention on the platform, a silent guardian over the execution he'd overseen. In the crowd, Eliza Vance remained motionless, her face a mask of stone. She'd thought watching Caleb die would bring some measure of closure, some sense that justice had balanced the scales. But standing here now, seeing the life choked out of another human being, she felt only a deep, hollow emptiness. James was still dead. Sarah still cried herself to sleep most nights, and this hanging, this public spectacle of death, hadn't changed any of that. When the 10 minutes elapsed, Garrett nodded to the hangman. They cut the body down and loaded it onto a wagon. Unmarked grave outside of town, as was customary for executed criminals. No headstone, no ceremony, no record except a brief notation in the territorial records. Caleb Rourke, hanged for robbery and murder, August 28, 1882. The crowd began to disperse, their morbid curiosity satisfied. They'd return to their shops and homes and jobs, tell stories about what they'd witnessed, embellish the details with each retelling until the truth became legend and the legend became myth. Boone Kessler stood near the gallows, watching the wagon carry Caleb's body away. The federal marshal had seen dozens of hangings over his career, and this one had been no different from the others. Justice served, law upheld, another outlaw removed from the frontier. Simple, clean, final. Except it didn't feel final. Something about this case still gnawed at him, some piece that didn't quite fit. The drunk clerk story remained implausible. The timing of the ambush at Saguaro Pass had been too perfect. Someone had known the Rourke gang would be there, had tipped off the law enforcement teams, had orchestrated the whole thing. But Caleb had taken that secret to his grave, if it existed at all. Kessler lit a cigarette and turned away from the gallows. He had other cases waiting, other criminals to track. The territory was growing, and with growth came crime. There was always another Caleb Rourke somewhere out there, making the same mistakes, running the same roads to the same inevitable end. Eliza remained in the plaza long after everyone else had left. She stood staring at the empty gallows, the rope now coiled and put away, the trapdoor reset and waiting for the next condemned soul. A boy of maybe 10 approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am, you all right?" She turned to look at him. "I'm fine. Thank you." "You knew him? The outlaw?" "No, I didn't know him at all." The boy nodded, not understanding but accepting the answer, and ran off to join his friends who were playing some game in the plaza. Their laughter echoed across the square, bright and innocent, untouched by the morning's darkness. Eliza walked to the livery stable where she'd left her wagon. The journey back to the homestead would take most of the day, and she wanted to be home before nightfall. Sarah was staying with neighbors, the Hendersons, good people who'd taken the girl in without question when Eliza had announced she needed to travel to Prescott. The stableman brought out her wagon and helped her up onto the seat. As she gathered the reins, he said, "Heard they hanged that outlaw this morning. You see it?" "Yes." "Good riddance, I say. Too many of his kind out there, thinking they can take what they want and hurt who they want without consequence." He spat in the dust. "Maybe this'll serve as a warning to others." Eliza didn't respond. She clicked her tongue at the horses and started the long drive home. The landscape rolled by, familiar and unchanging. She passed through Skull Valley, where she and James had sometimes come to buy supplies. The general store owner waved as she passed, and she waved back mechanically. Everything looked the same as it always had, but nothing felt the same. She thought about James constantly during the drive, the way he'd looked at her the first time they met at a church social in Tucson, the shy, awkward proposal he'd made after courting her for 6 months, their wedding day, simple and perfect, The birth of Sarah and the fierce protective love that had transformed James from a carefree young man into a devoted father. All of it gone now, erased by a bullet fired in a moment of chaos brought on by a desperate outlaw's lies. The sun was setting when she finally saw her homestead in the distance. The windmill turned slowly in the evening breeze. Smoke rose from the chimney. The Hendersons must have kept the fire going and stayed to wait for her return. As she pulled the wagon into the yard, Sarah burst from the house and ran toward her, braids flying behind her. Eliza climbed down and caught her daughter in a fierce embrace. "Mama, you're back! I missed you so much!" "I missed you too, sweetheart." Mrs. Henderson appeared on the porch, wiping flour from her hands. "Welcome home, Eliza. We kept Sarah fed and busy. She's been a good girl." "Thank you, Martha. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it." "No need for thanks. That's what neighbors do." Martha studied Eliza's face. Did you get what you needed in Prescott?" Eliza knew what she was really asking. Did watching the hanging help? Did it bring any peace? "I did what I needed to do," Eliza said carefully. "That's all." Martha nodded, understanding that some things couldn't be spoken aloud, especially not in front of Sarah. "Well, we'll be heading home then. You need anything at all, you send Sarah over." After the Hendersons left, Eliza made dinner, simple fare, beans and cornbread, while Sarah chattered about everything that had happened while she was gone. The neighbor's cat had kittens. She'd learned a new song. One of the Henderson boys had taught her how to skip stones on the creek. Normal things. Child things. Life continuing despite the weight of grief hanging over them both. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Eliza sat on the porch where James had died. Someone, probably the Hendersons, had scrubbed away the bloodstains, but Eliza could still see them in her mind's eye, could still hear the gunshot, still see James falling. She thought about what Caleb had said in the marshal's office. "I'm sorry." Such simple words, and he'd seemed to mean them. But sorry didn't resurrect the dead. Sorry didn't put food on the table or fix the windmill when it broke or do the 100 other things a homestead required. Eliza had received compensation from the territorial government, a small payment for James's death during a law enforcement action. It wasn't much, but combined with the money they'd saved, it would keep them going for a while. She'd have to hire help for the heavy work, or maybe sell the cattle and focus on crops that she could manage herself. She'd survive. She'd make sure Sarah survived. That's what James would have wanted. The stars came out one by one, filling the vast frontier sky with cold light. Eliza sat and watched them and thought about justice and revenge and whether there was really any difference between the two. In Prescott, Boone Kessler returned to his hotel room and poured himself a whiskey. He sat at the small desk by the window and pulled out his case file on the Rourke gang. Pages and pages of notes, witness statements, evidence carefully documented. The case was closed now, file complete, ready to be stored in some government archive where it would gather dust and eventually be forgotten. But Kessler couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He went through his notes again, reading each interview, each piece of testimony. The ambush at Saguaro Pass had been too clean, too well orchestrated. The marshals and hired guns had been positioned perfectly, knew exactly when the gang would arrive, exactly where they'd be. Someone had tipped them off. But who? Caleb had insisted it was a drunk clerk, but that didn't make sense. The Union Pacific had kept the shipment quiet. Only senior management and a few trusted guards had known about it. A clerk wouldn't have had access, unless the clerk hadn't been a clerk at all. Kessler sat up straighter, an idea forming. What if the clerk had been someone pretending to be a clerk? Someone who'd deliberately fed information to the Rourke gang, knowing they'd take the bait? Someone who'd wanted the gang caught or killed? But why? He pulled out another file, this one containing background information on the gang members. Jack Rourke, the leader. Thomas Rourke, the planner. Billy Crane, the youngest. And Caleb Rourke, the survivor. He read through Caleb's history. Orphaned young. First arrest at 16 for horse theft. Had ridden with several small outfits before forming the Rourke gang with his brothers. Known for being smart, cautious, nonviolent when possible. Then Kessler noticed something he'd overlooked before. 3 years ago, the Rourke gang had robbed a bank in Tombstone. They'd gotten away clean with $8,000, But a week later, a man named Richard Dalton, the bank's manager, had been found dead in his hotel room. Suicide, the local marshal had ruled. Left a note claiming he couldn't live with the shame of having been robbed. But what if it hadn't been suicide? What if Dalton had been killed because he could identify the gang members? Or what if he'd been killed for some other reason and someone had wanted revenge? Kessler dug deeper into Dalton's background. The man had a brother, Edward Dalton, a Union Pacific executive. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. Edward Dalton had wanted revenge for his brother's death. He'd set up the gold shipment as bait, had somehow leaked information to the Rourke gang through intermediaries, had arranged for law enforcement to be waiting. He'd orchestrated the whole thing to destroy the gang that had driven his brother to suicide, or to death, depending on what had really happened in that hotel room. Kessler sat back, his mind racing. It all fit. It all made terrible, perfect sense. But Caleb Rourke was already dead. The case was closed. And proving Edward Dalton had manipulated federal law enforcement to exact personal revenge would require resources and time that Kessler didn't have. He closed the file and finished his whiskey. Some truths he'd learned over the years were better left buried. Caleb had deserved to hang for his crimes regardless of how he'd been caught. Justice had been served, even if it had been justice with a hidden agenda behind it. Kessler went to bed that night with the weight of knowledge he couldn't act on, and told himself it didn't matter. But it did matter, and he knew it. 2 weeks later, in a comfortable office in San Francisco, Edward Dalton received a telegram from a colleague in Prescott, brief and to the point. Rourke hanged. Case closed. Dalton read it once, twice, then struck a match and burned the telegram in his ashtray. He watched the paper curl and blacken, watched the words disappear into ash and smoke. His brother Richard had been a good man, honest and hardworking. When the Rourke gang had robbed his bank, the shame had destroyed him. He'd written letters to Edward in the weeks before his death, letters full of despair and self-recrimination. And then he'd put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. At least, that was the official story. The truth was more complicated. Richard had discovered something in the bank's records after the robbery, evidence that one of the bank's board members had been embezzling for years. Richard had confronted the man, threatened to go to the authorities. 2 days later, Richard was dead, and the embezzler had fled to Mexico. But everyone assumed Richard's death was connected to the robbery, and Edward had let them believe it because it gave him a target for his grief and rage. He'd spent 3 years planning his revenge, had used his position at Union Pacific to create the perfect trap, had hired men to pose as drunk clerks in saloons the gang frequented, dropping hints about the gold shipment, had coordinated with federal marshals to set up the ambush, and it had worked. The Rourke gang was destroyed. Caleb Rourke had hanged. But sitting in his comfortable office, surrounded by the trappings of success and respectability, Edward Dalton felt no satisfaction. His brother was still dead. The embezzler was still free in Mexico, and he'd used federal resources to pursue a personal vendetta, putting lawmen's lives at risk for his own agenda. He'd become the very thing he'd claimed to be fighting against. Someone who broke the rules, who put personal desires above the law, who left destruction in his wake. The irony wasn't lost on him. Edward stood and walked to the window, looking out over San Francisco Bay. Ships moved in the harbor, commerce and trade flowing as it always did, the machinery of civilization grinding forward regardless of individual tragedies. He thought about Caleb Rourke, wondered if the man had guessed the truth in his final days. Probably not. Caleb had died thinking he'd been caught by bad luck and good detective work, never knowing he'd been a pawn in someone else's game of revenge. In the end, did it matter? The man was dead. Justice, of a sort, had been served. Edward turned away from the window and returned to his desk, to the stack of papers requiring his attention. Life went on. Business continued. The past couldn't be changed. But late at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, Edward Dalton sometimes wondered if he'd hanged the right man. Back in the Gila territory, Eliza Vance was learning to live with ghosts. She hired a drifter named Pete Sullivan to help with the heavy work around the homestead. Pete was 50 years old, weathered and worn, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put Sarah at ease. He fixed the windmill, mended fences, helped with the cattle. He never asked questions about James, never offered unwanted sympathy, just did his work and collected his pay. Slowly, Painfully, life found a new rhythm. Sarah went back to being a child, playing with the Henderson kids, learning her letters from the books Eliza had saved from her own childhood. The nightmares about her father's death came less frequently. Eliza threw herself into keeping the homestead running. She woke before dawn, worked until after dark, fell into bed exhausted every night. It was the only way she knew to keep the grief at bay. Stay busy, stay moving, never stop long enough for the pain to catch up. One evening in late September, Pete approached her as she was feeding the chickens. "Mrs. Vance, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "You planning to keep this place running long term? Or are you thinking about selling, maybe moving somewhere easier?" Eliza paused, scattering grain for the hens. It was a question she'd been avoiding asking herself. The homestead represented years of work, dreams she and James had shared, but it also represented hardship and danger and the memory of violence. "I don't know," she admitted. "Some days I think we should sell and move to Tucson, start fresh somewhere Sarah can go to a real school where there are more people around. Other days I think staying is what James would have wanted. Can I offer some advice?" "Please, don't make the decision based on what a dead man would have wanted. Make it based on what the living need." Pete's voice was gentle but firm. "I lost my wife and son to cholera 15 years ago. Spent a decade trying to live the life they would have wanted me to live. Nearly destroyed me. Finally figured out that honoring the dead means living well, not living in the past." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "How do you know what living well looks like anymore?" "You don't. You make your best guess and adjust as you go." He gestured toward where Sarah was playing with a stick and a hoop in the yard. "That little girl needs her mother healthy and whole more than she needs this particular piece of land. You ask yourself what's best for both of you, and then you do that thing, whatever it is." That night, after Sarah was asleep, Eliza sat down with paper and pencil and made a list. Reasons to stay, reasons to go, resources available, possibilities for the future. The exercise was clarifying. By the time dawn broke, she'd made her decision. She would sell the homestead to Pete Sullivan, who'd expressed interest in buying it if she ever wanted to sell. She'd take the money and move to Tucson, where Sarah could attend school, where Eliza could find work, where they could build a new life untainted by tragedy. It wasn't running away, she told herself. It was choosing life over memory. It was survival. 3 months later, on a cold December morning, Eliza and Sarah left the homestead for the last time. Their belongings were packed in a wagon Pete had sold them at cost. The deed to the property had been transferred, money exchanged, legalities satisfied. Sarah looked back as they drove away, watching the only home she'd ever known disappear behind them. "Will we ever come back, Mama?" "Maybe someday, when you're older, if you want to." "Will Papa be waiting for us in Tucson?" Eliza's heart clenched. Sarah still sometimes forgot, still sometimes asked questions that assumed James was coming back. The doctor had said it was normal, part of how children processed grief. "No, sweetheart, Papa's gone, but his memory will be with us wherever we go." "I don't want his memory, I want him." "I know, baby, I know." They rode in silence for a while. Then Sarah said, "That man who died, the outlaw. Do you think he was sorry, really sorry?" Eliza thought about Caleb Rourke's last words on the gallows. "I'm sorry for all of it. The rawness in his voice, the defeat in his posture." "Yes," she said finally. "I think he was. But being sorry doesn't undo what was done." "Then what's the point of being sorry?" It was a child's question, but it cut to the heart of something Eliza had been wrestling with for months. "The point," she said slowly, "is that even when we can't fix what we've broken, we can acknowledge the breaking. We can witness the harm we've caused. That's not nothing." Sarah seemed to accept this. She turned her attention back to the road ahead, to the future waiting for them in Tucson. Eliza drove the wagon east, away from the homestead and its ghosts, toward a city where nobody knew her story and nobody would look at her with pity or curiosity. A place to start over. Behind them, the sun rose over the Gila territory, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. The land remained, indifferent to human tragedy, enduring as it had endured for thousands of years before and would endure for thousands of years after. In Prescott, the gallows stood empty in the plaza, waiting for the next condemned soul. Marshal Garrett went about his duties, keeping peace in a territory that never quite seemed peaceful. Denton Chase and his bounty hunters rode out on a new contract, tracking a different outlaw who'd made different mistakes but would likely meet the same end. Cotton, the young bounty hunter with the sick wife, took his share of the Rourke reward and quit the profession. He moved to California with his wife, used the money to buy a small orange grove, and never spoke of his bounty hunting days again. His wife lived another 3 years before consumption finally claimed her, but they were 3 good years, and Cotton was grateful for them. Boone Kessler continued his work as a federal marshal, tracking criminals across the territory with the same methodical patience that had made him legendary. But he never forgot of the Rourke case, never quite shook the feeling that justice had been served with dirty hands. In his private files, kept locked in a drawer in his office, he maintained notes on Edward Dalton and the suspicious circumstances around the Union Pacific trap. He told himself he'd pursue it someday, when he had time and resources. He never did. Years passed. The frontier began to close, railroads spreading like veins across the landscape, bringing with them law and order and the slow death of the wild spaces. Towns grew into cities. Outlaws became legends, their crimes softened by distance and time until they seemed almost romantic. The Rourke gang became one of those legends. Dime novels were written about them, embellishing their exploits, making them into folk heroes who'd fought against the tyranny of the railroads and banks. In these stories, Caleb Rourke died nobly, defiant to the end, a victim of a corrupt system. The truth was messier, less heroic, and largely forgotten. In Tucson, Eliza Vance built a new life. She found work as a seamstress, her skills with needle and thread earning enough to keep a small apartment and feed herself and Sarah. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she married James, but it was stable and safe, and that was enough. Sarah grew up strong and smart, with her mother's practical nature and her father's quiet courage. She became a teacher, married a kind man who worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad, had 3 children of her own. She never forgot her father, but the memory became softer over time, less sharp, integrated into who she was rather than defining her completely. On her deathbed many years later, when Sarah was an old woman surrounded by her own grandchildren, she spoke about her father for the first time in decades. "He was a good man," she said to her eldest granddaughter. "He tried to protect us. He didn't deserve what happened to him." "What did happen to him, Grandma?" Sarah closed her eyes, seeing again that dawn morning, the men with guns, the blood on the porch boards. He met the wrong person at the wrong time, and it cost him everything. Was the person punished? Yes. He was hanged. Did that make it better? Sarah thought about that for a long time before answering. "No," she said finally. "It didn't make it better. It just made it over." And that, in the end, was the truth that no legend or story could capture. Justice hadn't healed the wound. Revenge hadn't brought comfort. Caleb Rourke's death hadn't resurrected James Vance or restored what had been lost. It had simply ended the story, drawing a line under the final chapter and closing the book. In an unmarked grave outside Prescott, Caleb Rourke's bones lay mixed with the desert dust. No headstone marked the spot. No flowers were ever placed there. Eventually, the town grew outward and the cemetery was relocated, and even the approximate location of his grave was forgotten. His brothers, Jack and Thomas and Billy, were buried somewhere in Saguaro Pass, their graves lost to time and weather. The gold they'd stolen was returned to the Union Pacific and deposited safely in the Territorial Bank. The badge Caleb had used to lie his way into the Vance homestead was tossed into an evidence box and eventually lost or stolen. All the physical traces of Caleb Rourke faded and disappeared, but the consequences of his choices rippled outward, touching lives he'd never met, influencing futures he'd never see. Sarah's children and grandchildren carried forward the legacy of James Vance's death, their very existence a testament to Eliza's strength in surviving tragedy. Edward Dalton's manipulation of federal resources eventually led to stricter oversight of Union Pacific security operations. Boone Kessler's doubts about the case influenced how he approached later investigations, making him more skeptical, more thorough. One man's desperate flight from justice, one man's bad choices and worse luck had changed the shape of the world in small but permanent ways. And in the end, that was perhaps the harshest justice of all. Not the rope, not the unmarked grave, but the knowledge that Caleb Rourke's life had mattered only for the damage it had done. His legacy wasn't the robberies or the escapes or the brief moments of triumph. His legacy was pain, loss, and the scars left on people who'd had the misfortune to cross his path. The frontier didn't forgive men like Caleb Rourke. It simply swallowed them whole and moved on, vast and indifferent, erasing their footprints from the sand and leaving nothing behind but whispers and shadows and the occasional story told around a campfire about the outlaw who ran out of luck. In the scorched territory where it had all begun, the wind blew across empty plains, carrying away dust and memory in equal measure. The sun beat down on the same cracked earth that had watched Caleb stumble bleeding toward the Vance homestead. The desert remained, patient and eternal, keeping its secrets and its dead. And somewhere in that endless expanse, maybe a ghost walked, a man with a bullet wound in his side and a badge he'd stolen clutched in his hand, still running, still trying to outpace the consequences of his choices, still searching for a peace he'd never found in life. But probably not. Probably there was just wind and dust and silence. Probably Caleb Rourke was exactly what he'd always been, a man who'd made bad choices, paid the price, and left nothing behind but lessons learned at the cost of other people's blood. The frontier had its justice, and in that harsh, unforgiving land, justice didn't shout or make grand pronouncements. It simply waited, patient as stone, until every debt was paid and every runner had nowhere left to run. Then it took everything and moved on.